Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing very well. I'm doing so much better, thank you very much. And so I hope you're also in top form. But before we continue with part 4 of our story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's continue with the last part of our story tonight. Please tell me all about it. I really want to know. I'm fascinated, Fern pleaded, insisting on making Russell another cup of cocoa and telling the family that they were welcome to stay in the house overnight and leave in the morning. So Russell's wife was getting the children to bed and was reading them a book in the living room, while Russell continued to tell Fern his mother's incredulous account. My mother, as I was telling you, was not liked very much by the local community when she lived here. People misunderstood her. She was, as I was saying earlier, rather aloof. She didn't get involved with the locals very much. The truth was my mother wanted to make friends, but she didn't know how to go about it. The only time she ever visited anyone was when she was as drunk as a skunk. Oh, I know all about that, laughed Fern. Amelia put me well into the picture. Apparently your mother arrived on her doorstep in a drunken state, claiming she was being stalked. At that time, Amelia thought it was a man in the local vicinity who'd been spying on your mother. She was encouraging your mother to go to the police. But all this time, it was a Bigfoot that had been stalking your mum. So you know the story then. My mother was probably the way she was because she'd been homeschooled. She'd grown up with a governess, you see, who attended to her every need, so she never interacted with the local kids, which was desperately sad. She happened to mention once that she was related to an English baron, and word spread around the close in a frenzy, and people automatically assumed that my mother thought she was better than everybody else in the close, and that's why she didn't want to befriend anyone. The reality is my mother was actually desperately shy, so she was socially quite awkward. People would say she married my father because she could control him, but that was not true either. My father absolutely was the head of our household, and my mother didn't bully him as people claimed. She married my father because she loved the bones of him. Then there were people who claimed my mother was incredibly vain because men were drawn to her, rather like bees around a honeypot. But she hated all the attention she got from men. It made her feel distinctly uncomfortable. My mother kept herself to herself, and she managed a perfect house. She was rather OCD, you could say, making sure everything in the house was squeaky clean and perfect. The only thing that really bothered her, her biggest pet hate, was if we left our bathroom towels lying across the floor, or didn't put our shoes away in our cupboard. Stuff like that. My mother was extremely house-proud, I'll give her that. So she could sometimes nag us a little. She also believed in keeping fit every single day. So she'd climb under the wooden pole fencing in the backyard and take a shortcut through the woods. She liked being very close to nature, you see. She found taking a casual stroll through the trees helped her to relax, and it kept her in good shape. When she began her walks, she would sometimes feel that she was being watched, and that feeling persisted for many years, until she got used to it and began to pay the feeling very little attention. Then one day as she was walking down the earthen trail, that was when she saw a male Bigfoot. She was in such a dreadful shock, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The Bigfoot was holding a big bunch of wild flowers in his hands. He walked up to her and handed them to her just like that. My mother was absolutely terrified, as the Bigfoot was so enormously big. But he seemed rather bashful and glided away. But she got the profound sense he was watching her, to see how she reacted to the wild flowers he had given her. So she took them home. She said the way the male Bigfoot looked at her was not sexual, but adoringly, as if he really liked her. For a while she didn't walk into the woods after that. So the Bigfoot suddenly started coming to the window to look into the house to see if he could see my mother. I assume the male Bigfoot missed not seeing my mother taking her regular walk in the woods. He was always leaving behind wild flowers on the doorstep for my mother. Bunches and bunches of these things. My mother adored wild flowers. I guess the Bigfoot knew this. He must have seen her picking them in the fields. My mother would bring them into the house, even if they barely lasted a day. One day my mother was in the yard, innocently planting some pretty summer seedlings. I know I've told you this part of the story before, but it makes things flow more smoother if I repeat them. She was on her last seedling, which she was about to plant in the ground, when she sensed a presence. She looked up to see the male Bigfoot standing there. She didn't scream, of course. She froze to the spot. The Bigfoot took the seedling from her hand and placed it neatly into the ground, and then he threw her over his shoulders and was gone. My mother said she tried to scream, but she just could not. The Bigfoot ran with her for what seemed like a long time. He went up this hilly elevation, and before she knew it, she found herself being put down in a cave. The cave was covered with a curtain of thick shrubbery. Because you couldn't see it, it was so well hidden. My mother said not in a million trillion years would anybody know that cave was there. It took my mother a while to adjust to the dimming light of the cave. She said the floor was covered with animal skins, and there were beds made up of sticks and layers of moss. She said it was rather cosy. Your poor mum! She must have been terrified out of her wits. She was. But she said the male Bigfoot, when he put her down on the ground and encouraged her to sit down, would just stare at her as if she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever beheld. He even came up to her to touch her skin, and he'd go, "Ah," as if he thought she was so lovely. My mother said he told her in his head that she was very beautiful, and he was never going to hurt her. He'd look after her and make her very happy. He was not interested in her sexually, she knew that, but he wanted to keep her as something he could admire. My mother told the male Bigfoot in her head that she wanted to go home, but the male Bigfoot seemed to pretend not to know what she was saying. He finally turned around and said to her in her head, "This is your new home. I'll make you very happy here." My mother tried to not look at the Bigfoot when she was figuring how she'd escape him, as she knew unequivocally the creature could read her mind. He presented her with some berries and some pieces of squirrel that my mother said smelt repugnantly rank. But she took nothing from the male Bigfoot, so he seemed grievously upset by this. Then his eyes suddenly brightened, as if he had a great idea. He told her, in her head, that he was going to get her some wild flowers to make her happy. So that's what he did. He left the cave and scurried away, and was gone for quite a while, leaving my mother to fend for herself all alone. But she knew she was not nimble enough to escape this cave, otherwise she'd have done so in a heartbeat. My mother peered out of the cave and realized it was so high up in the steep rock face that if she attempted climbing down these rocks, she could potentially do herself some serious harm and even fall to her death. She was considering all this when another Bigfoot entered the cave. It was a female Bigfoot. She was carrying a couple of dead squirrels in her hands. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw my mother. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. "So you think that this was the male Bigfoot's partner?" asked Fern. "Oh, there's no doubt about that. They were obviously a couple, although my mother never saw any children. My mother said she felt such relief to see the female Bigfoot. She knew that the creature would help her. She actually didn't feel any fear, even though the female Bigfoot was incredibly imposing. The female Bigfoot had very warm, treacle-coloured eyes that seemed very kind. She shook her head in bewilderment when she saw my mother, and spoke to my mother telepathically. "It's you! I can't believe it! What are you doing here in our cave?" "Don't tell me. I know the answer to that question already. Elkin brought you here, didn't he?" "I warned him about you, not to get any ideas about you in his head. But he wouldn't listen, would he? You mustn't be afraid of Elkin. He'd never hurt you. He's harmless. He just wants to look at you, like he does with all the pretty things he collects." The female Bigfoot pointed to a pile of beautiful stones that my mother hadn't observed before. And she told her that the stones all belonged to Elkin. "Please, can you help me?" My mother asked the female Bigfoot in her head. The communication was all telepathic. He's coming back soon. I know he is. He's going to pick me some wildflowers in the meadow. And I know he wants to keep me. I think he's fixated on me, like he is with those stones over there. But I'm not a possession. I'm a mother. I have children and a husband to take care of. I can't possibly stay here. Of course you can't stay here. That would be completely impractical. Elkin may love beautiful things. That's why he brought you here. It's your fair skin that's done it, I'm afraid. The whiter the skin, the more beautiful you are in Elkin's eyes. When he saw you years ago, he got so terribly excited. I've seen him spying on you when you go for your walks in the woods almost every day until you stopped walking, because I know you had an encounter with Elkin, so that's why you don't come into the woods anymore. I knew one of these days he'd overcome his shyness and not be able to help himself, but bring you to live with us. I told him it would never ever work out. Your kind would easily die if you were to live in the wild like we do. You couldn't possibly survive. You don't have the strength to endure our hard lives. Look at you. You're a tiny, fragile thing. Very feeble you are. Elkin could so easily break you. I need to get you back safely to your house. But my advice is to you to leave at once. Otherwise Elkin will bring you back again, and again, and again. And I won't be able to stop him. Honestly, he is the end. He brought a pretty bird into the cave once, you know. But no, it wasn't to eat as you might expect. It was to watch all day long, because it was so beautiful, with magnificent feathers, and such a pretty bird song. And Elkin was fascinated by it. I let the poor little bird fly away. We never ate it because it had suffered enough as far as I was concerned. It was glad to escape. But that's Elkin for you. He collects pretty things from stones to feathers. And now it's you. I always knew he'd bring you here one day. And it seems I wasn't wrong about that. My mother said the female Bigfoot told her there was no time to lose, as Elkin would be back. So she threw her on her shoulders and raced through the grove as fast as she could, to bring my mother back to safety. You must leave at once, she told my mother again. Elkin won't be happy if you're not here when he returns, when he comes back with the flowers. But I'm going to let him believe you managed to escape. He'll be mad at me if he knows I helped you. So I shan't be telling him how you got out. Goodness gracious me! When your mother returned home, she was greeted to Russell and Kirsty, who both refused to believe her story, after she'd been through such a harrowing ordeal. That must have been devastating for her, not to be believed, I mean. Well, it was in the beginning. But my mother was in such a discernible panic. She kept saying, "The Bigfoot wants to keep me like a doe. He's coming back after me, I know he is. We need to leave at once." My father kept saying, "This joke has gone on for long enough, love. Why don't you quit while you're ahead? Because it's beginning to irk me. Honestly, some of these jokes of yours, they go far too far. They're not funny anymore." I'm not trying to be funny. I wish you'd believe me. Mum, quit the games you're playing with us. Granted, you acted out your part very well, and congratulations for that. I can see you've just been hoaxing us. And as Dad says, it's getting terribly boring. I was getting mad at my father and sister. I said, "I'm telling you the truth. Mum is not lying to you. She was abducted by a male Bigfoot, and she managed to escape. If this was a joke, you would be right. We'd have gone for far too far on this. But I assure you it is not a joke." My mother burst into tears when she realized I believed her. "You believe me, Rusty?" she asked me. I took my mother in my arms and rocked her gently. "Of course I believe you, Mum. I saw the Bigfoot abduct you. I called Dad at the butchery to tell him, but he just laughed. He thought I was joking." Let's just say, after a while, something in my father's attitude seemed to shift. It was like he suddenly realized that this wasn't a wind-up. It was getting dark outside, and my father was staring out of the window, and that's when he observed the male Bigfoot. The Bigfoot was standing on the edge of the woods and staring fixedly at our house, and in his arms he had a great big bunch of wild flowers. Well, we disappeared out of the back of the house,
climbed through a window, and we got into our car and drove all the way to Atlanta. We never came back. My father really believed my mother could be abducted again by the male Bigfoot, so getting away seemed like the most obvious thing for our family to do. We began a new life for ourselves. My mother had plenty of money, so we soon forgot about our home in Fairfield Close, and we got on with our new lives. And one day my mother told me, after I was married to my wife, that if I wanted Fairfield House it was mine, but I needed to sell it, as she wanted nothing more to do with the place, given what had happened to her. I was informed by the estate agent the house had descended into a great deal of decay, and that if I wanted a good price I'd need to fix it up. I just left it on the market, hoping someone discerning like you would come along to restore the place. And that's exactly what you and your husband did. So now you know exactly why we up and left all those years ago.
Now I know, and it's a fascinating story. Thank you for confiding in me, Rusty.
It's a pleasure.
2 years later. Fern had long since forgotten about the evening when she had met the Drifter family, who had stayed overnight at her home, and who had told her the real reason why the family up and left all those years ago. It had been an extraordinary story, one that she knew she'd never forget. Fern had never believed in Bigfoots before, but after she had listened to Rusty's account, she was in no doubt that the story was unequivocally true. What reason would Rusty have to make up something like this? And it certainly explained why they up and left their home all those years ago. Rusty had shown Fern a photograph of his mother Ruth, and she had been very impressed by how white Ruth's skin was. The only other person she knew with skin as white as that was her mother's. "My mother's got beautiful skin like Ruth has," she told Rusty. "Good job my mother's not walking around those woods," she joked lightly. "I don't think I shall have any problems with a male Bigfoot. My skin is not pale. I take after my father in that way. I should be thankful for small mercies."
"I doubt the Bigfoot's still around," said Rusty. "I'm quite sure they must move around."
"But you don't know that for sure," Fern had said.
"True," Rusty acknowledged. "But I just have a feeling. After all, you don't know how long they live, do you? I'm sure life must be hard for them, out in the wild, exposed to the perils of the natural world. Besides, I'm certain they must follow water and food sources."
"That's probably true," Fern agreed. "But I'm sure they still have their favourite haunts that they return to from time to time." The truth was, Fern knew many of the locals in the area went for regular walks in the woodgrove, and everyone she'd asked told her the walking in the woods was magical. No one ever mentioned the feeling of being watched or anything like that. As a consequence, Fern decided to take regular walks in the woods, only because her husband Larkin had decided that having a cat was not enough.
"We should get a couple of puppies," he told her. One day he returned home with 2 English bulldog puppies, and Fern was completely besotted over the dogs, even though they slobbered around the place and snored. But the couple found the dogs highly entertaining. The bulldogs were both female. Fern chose to call them Popsicle and Delilah. Things were going swimmingly for the young couple, who had settled into the close seamlessly and made an abundance of new friends. So Fern never felt alone when her husband was away working. She had developed a close relationship with Amelia next door, but had decided not to tell her good friend the real reason why the Drifters had left Fairfield House all those years ago in such a terrible rush. Some things were not worth confiding in, and that story was so incredulous it would be hard to believe it was true. Fern never experienced the feeling of being watched when she regularly took Popsicle and Delilah for their walks, and before long she'd forgotten all about the strange abduction of Ruth Drifter and the male Bigfoot, who was in awe of the fair-skinned beauty. It was on a casual, carefree Friday morning, when Fern was vigorously wiping down the white quartz countertops in her magnificent kitchen, as the warm sunshine magnanimously trickled through the windows. She heard the sound of a car engine purring, and glanced briefly out of the window, only to see her mother's bright pink Range Rover coming to an abrupt halt outside her front door. Fern was not used to her mother arriving at her house like this unannounced. Usually when she came to visit, she was always with her husband, but not today. Where was Fern's father, she wondered, and why was her mother visiting her impromptu like this? The bulldogs rushed to the front door unhesitantly,
They were barking excitedly, but Fern was staring out the window, watching her mother. What on earth was her mother doing here, Fern wondered. She watched her mother elegantly climb out of the car, looking as glamorous as ever, but that wasn't unusual. But to Fern's horror, she went over to the trunk and pulled out a bright pink suitcase, and Fern knew what that meant. Her mother was intending to come to stay here for a few days. But why? Fern's mother was wearing a stylish pair of white chinos, a golden belt, and a pale pink cashmere cardigan, with a little necklace of pearls around her neck. Fern's next-door neighbour, Amelia, when she first laid eyes on Fern's mother, had told her that Fern's mother bore an uncanny, striking resemblance to Ruth Drifter.
Your mother, Fern, dear, could be the doppelganger for Ruth Drifter, you know. She's got the same perfect peachy porcelain skin and locks of long dark hair, along with those contrasting piercing blue eyes. She's a very striking woman, your mother, just like Ruth Drifter was. Indeed, they could have both been sisters, you know.
Everyone had commented tirelessly about Fern's mother growing up, about what a stunningly beautiful woman she was. But Fern's mother hated being so fair, and complained that she could never get a tan. No one realised what a difficult woman Robin was. And Fern would always think, if only you knew what my mother is like to live with, then you wouldn't think she was so beguiling. Fern never looked on her mother through other people's eyes, but on this unassuming morning, Fern was struck by how lovely her mother looked. For a woman in her late 40s, she looked exceptionally good. But then she'd always taken very good care of herself. She went to Callanetics regularly, and took regular walks around the neighbourhood where she lived, to keep fit, and sometimes she danced around her house to 80s music, and was careful never to overindulge in naughty food. Fern's mother's bipolar meant she could be effusive one minute and very depressed the next, but the medication she took seemed to balance her mood and make her more stable. But growing up, when her mother sometimes surreptitiously chose not to take her medication, as she claimed the lithium would make her sometimes feel as if she was dead on the inside, it was during those tumultuous, erratic times that Fern and her father were exposed to the inevitable highs and lows of her bipolar disorder. But as her father would say, there was one big plus to the condition. Life was never boring, and that was true. Moments later, Fern heard the familiar clippity-cloppity sound of her mother's very impractical high-heel shoes as she trotted to the front door and rang the doorbell, so that around and around the mulberry bush goes the teddy bear played out through the speakers. The bulldogs were by now going ballistic, as Fern finally opened the door to her mother. "Ma'am, this is a surprise. What are you doing here?" she asked. Her mother walked past her into the entrance hall, as the dogs mounted her legs to greet her. "That's a very nice greeting, love. I thought you'd be pleased to see me." "But of course I'm pleased to see you, Mum. But this is a surprise." "I've left your father, Fern, just so you know. I've had quite enough of the man. He is the end. Don't look at me like that, Fern. Your father does not appreciate me. I'm leaving him for good now. My mind is permanently made up. There is no going back on it." Over the years growing up, there were dozens of times when Robin had sauntered off and claimed she was leaving her husband, and Fern's father, with his tail between his legs, would seek his wife out and beg her forgiveness and ask her to come home. And of course Robin always would. She seemed to enjoy the fuss she created, and the fact that her husband would be grovelling over her the next few days, buying her chocolates and flowers to keep her sweet, and taking her out to dine at the finest restaurants. "What's he gone and done now?" said Fern, rolling her eyes in exasperation, as if her mother was a belligerent teenager making a fuss about absolutely nothing. "Your father forgot our anniversary. Can you believe that? He forgot our anniversary yesterday. What man ever forgets his wife's anniversary? We've been married for 28 years, for goodness sake. And then your father does this to me. It's appalling. That's what it is. Absolutely appalling. He should be absolutely ashamed of himself." Robin abandoned her pink suitcase in the entrance hall and swiftly marched off into the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea. Mum, I'm sure Dad didn't do this intentionally. Forget your anniversary, I mean. You did tell him he'd forgotten, didn't you?
Of course I didn't tell him he'd forgotten, love. Why should I remind him about something like this? He already knows when we got married all those years ago. We've been married for 28 years, and he doesn't remember the most important day of our lives. How can he do this to me, Fern? Hopefully now that I've left him, he might start to figure out what he's done wrong.
How is he going to figure it out, Mum, if you don't tell him?
Oh, he'll figure it out soon enough. I'm staying with you for a few days, Fern, and I'm not going to speak to him until he apologizes for this travesty, because that is what this is, Fern, an absolute travesty.
Mum, don't you think you're overreacting a little?
Of course I'm not overreacting, love. I've been married to your father for 28 years, and he has never, and I repeat, never once forgotten our anniversary until now. Yesterday morning he never said anything to me, and I thought maybe he was going to surprise me later on in the day by whisking me off somewhere magical. I thought he was pretending to have forgotten our anniversary. So I called his bluff. But when he came home without flowers or champagne, and without any indication he was taking me out to dinner, I was completely devastated. I asked him if he'd forgotten something, and he said to me, "Yes, love, I'm afraid I forgot to buy eggs at the store. But you'll be glad to know I didn't forget the sourdough bread you asked for, or the honey buns you wanted." Well, he was very lucky he forgot those eggs, because I would have thrown them at his head if given the chance. Your father is the end, Fern. Well, I stormed off to my bedroom, locked the door behind me, and let him fix his own dinner. Do you know what he said to me? Do you know what he said to me, Fern?
No, what did he say to you, Mum?
He said, "Have you forgotten to take your meds, love? Is that what this is all about? Because you're in quite a stroppy mood tonight." Can you believe he said that to me, Fern?
So you decided that the first thing you would do is come out here, Mum, and get Dad to try and figure out why you're so upset?
Don't worry, Fern. I left your father a note. I told him in the note, "How could you forget? I'm leaving you, and don't even bother trying to find me."
Oh, Mum, said Fern, wrapping her arms lovingly around her mother and giving her a warm hug. You're incorrigible, you know. I'm sure it's upsetting that he forgot your anniversary, but Dad is a busy man. He probably got distracted or something. It happens. Is it really such a big deal? You know he loves the bones of you. And whenever you cross with him, you always tell him you're leaving him. But you never really mean what you say.
Oh, I do, Fern, and I mean it now. I've never been more serious in my entire life about anything. If my husband chooses to forget our anniversary, then it pointedly shows that he's not thinking about me at all. Now I need to unpack my things and settle down, and I'm going to take a walk around the local neighbourhood if I may.
Why don't you take a walk in the Woodgrove, Mum? You can take the bulldogs with you if you like.
No, thanks, I'd rather walk on my own. I need to clear my mind. I'm very upset with your father, and it's all I can think about at the moment. The man is such a disappointment to me. How could he possibly forget our anniversary like this?
A few hours later, after Fern's mother had happily settled down, her mother got dressed into some lycra leggings, some sneakers and a sweatshirt, and Fern watched her climbing under the wooden pole fencing and sauntering down the woodland trail through the woods. While her mother was out, she took this opportunity to phone her father.
"Hello, Fern. This is a surprise, you're calling me out of the blue like this. It's a pleasure to hear from you. How are things going?"
"I'm fine, Dad. I'm afraid to say you're in the doghouse with Mum. You do realise that, don't you?"
"Oh, I know all about that," said Fern's father, sighing down the phone. "Your mother stormed off to her bedroom last night in quite the huff, slamming the door behind her and locking me out. I had to sleep on the couch. I think she might have forgotten to take her medication for the last couple of days or so. She's been in a very petulant mood. You should have seen the glare she gave me. She looked like a rabid cat that wanted to scratch my eyes out. Goodness gracious me. Your mother is in quite the state at the moment. I don't know what to do about it.
Dad, she's arrived here at my house with a suitcase. She says she's leaving you for good, and she's left you a note to tell you not to come after her, as it's over between the two of you.
Fern's father sighed again. Oh, not all this fiasco all over again. Your mother is such a drama queen. I don't know what has got into her of late. You say she's at your house now with her suitcase, and she intends to stay for a few days.
That's right. She's unpacked her suitcase. She's pretty much moved into the spare room.
Honestly, Fern, I do apologise. I'm sorry your mother has dragged you into our petty little squabble like this. Honestly, I don't know what is irking the woman. Good job I love her so much.
Dad, you've really upset her.
Of course I've upset her, Fern. Tell me something I don't know. I just wish to God I knew why she's in such a state.
Dad, you've been married to Mum for 28 years. You forgot your anniversary. Mum is devastated about it. You know missing your anniversary is a hanging offence for Mum, as far as she's concerned.
Fern's father whistled down the phone. Bloody hell! How could I have forgotten our anniversary? I better get my act together, hadn't I? I think some grovelling is well in order. You know your mother loves it when I grovel. I'll see you soon, love. I need to buy that woman the largest bouquet of flowers I can possibly find, and think of doing something special. Maybe I can redeem myself, if I try my very best.
You better try very hard, Dad, because Mum isn't easily swayed. She's in quite an obnoxious mood at the moment. It was true, of course. Fern's mother, Robin, was not in a good mood. It could clearly be seen in the way she thundered through the woodgrove, kicking up leaves and twigs in her path, almost as if in some way she was lashing out at her husband. How dare he forget our anniversary? Were the thoughts whirling around in Robin's head. How dare he? I cannot believe he did this to me. We've been married for 28 years, for goodness sake. As Robin trudged down the earthen trail, a pretty sunlight spilled through the trees. The forest was abundantly alive with the trills of pretty birdsong. Whether Robin observed its beguiling allure or not is debatable. Her mind was an angry spin of maddened thoughts, all directed at her husband, and his long list of shortcomings that were increasing by the bucket load. This time I'm not going home, she told herself very firmly. I will move in with Fern indefinitely, until our divorce is finalised. I'm sure Fern will be really happy to have me around. I know she gets lonely with Larkin being away at home for long periods of time. I'm not putting up with that husband of mine for a second longer. He forgets our anniversary. It's shameful, that's what it is. The gall of it. Robin's mind was far away from the walk she was taking through the trees, so it was like she was almost on autopilot. After a short while, Robin became rather uneasy. She stopped short in her tracks. Was someone following her, she wondered. She had a profound sense she was not alone, and someone was there watching her. The feeling sent a nasty chill down her spine. "Hello," she called out. "Is anybody there?" She was met with a rather disquieting silence, and even the bird song appeared to have dissipated. I should have walked around the neighbourhood, Robin thought to herself. I don't feel comfortable among the trees here. Something is definitely watching me. And then there, stepping out of the trees, was a male Bigfoot, staring straight at Fern's mother, and in his hands he held a flower, which he was holding out to her. The Bigfoot appeared bashfully shy, rather reticent. He was all male, and looking at Robin, as if he thought she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever beheld. Robin was paralysed with fear. The Bigfoot was very scary. He was so massive in size, and the only thought that Robin could think was, "He's going to kill me! I need to get the hell out of here!" A scream erupted from her mouth, rather like a shrill ambulance siren, and with a pounding heart she ran as fast as she could through the woods, with the Bigfoot trailing behind her. Robin was utterly terrified, believing that her life was ebbing away. When the Bigfoot finally grabbed her, she did scream out, but he caught her and thrust a flower into her hand, and then he just simply glided away and was gone from her sight.
When Robin returned to Fern's house, she was in a dreadful state, her heart palpitating, sweat pouring down her face, and the only words that Fern got out of her mother were, "I just don't believe it! I don't believe it!" Fern's mother couldn't believe what had happened to her, that she had encountered a male Bigfoot, but she knew if she told anyone about the encounter, they would believe it was her bipolar that was talking, and that she had been hallucinating, but she knew what she had seen was real. "The Bigfoot chased after me, and gave me a flower, and the look he gave me was almost besotted," she thought. "I wish my husband looked at me like that. That male Bigfoot could teach my husband a thing or two about chivalry." "Ma'am, what's going on with you?" asked Fern. "Why are you as white as a sheet? You look as if you've had quite the shock." "Well, I just can't stop thinking about your father, that's all. Why he forgot our anniversary," said Robin, not wanting to share her incredulous encounter with her daughter. It was later that afternoon. Fern's rather sheepish-looking father arrived at her doorstep with a huge bouquet of flowers in his hand, along with a bottle of French champagne. He was met with a frosty, cold reception from his wife, who was glaring at him contemptuously. "I'm very sorry, love. I'm so sorry. What a fool I've been. I can't believe I forgot our anniversary. It's unforgivable. Can you accept my apology? I'm so sorry." "Is that all you can say? That you're sorry? We've been married for 28 years, and you forget the most important day of our entire lives. How could you do this to me? It's quite the shocker. It really is." "I'm very sorry, love. As I was saying, there are no excuses. I'm a bundling idiot, I really am. But I still love you with all my heart. And I'm going to make it up to you big time, love. I promise you that." "You're going to have to do a hell of a lot better than that if you want to win me back into your life. I can assure you of that, love. As I told you, I'm leaving you for good. I'm moving in with Fern until the divorce is finalized. You don't deserve to be married to a woman like me. If you forget the most important date of my entire life, of our entire lives, I'll have you know." "You're right, love. I've never deserved you. I'm very well aware of that. But I hope I might persuade you to change your mind," he said, handing Robin an envelope. Robin snatched the envelope from her husband rather greedily, like a seagull snatching someone's sandwich on the beach. "What is this?" she asked suspiciously, studying her husband through curious eyes. "Why don't you open it up and see?" Robin tore open the envelope and then stared down at the ticket that she was holding. "Oh, goodness gracious me! Is this true? It's Paris! Are we going to Paris? Is this a trip to Paris?" "That's right, love. You've always told me you wanted to go to Paris. So we're going to spend some time there. And some time in the south of France as well." "Oh, goodness gracious me!" said Robin, her eyes shining. "Paris! I can't believe it. This is a ticket to Paris, Fern." "You're lucky, Mum. A trip to Paris? I've always wanted to go there. You're lucky." "Oh, I can't believe it." "It's Paris," said my husband. "Does that mean I'm forgiven?" Robin threw her arms around her husband. "Oh, yes, you're forgiven. That's the best present. Oh, my word, thank you." Fern grinned from ear to ear. Her father's grovelling had paid off in leaps and bounds, and Fern's mother seemed to have forgotten about the divorce she had been previously threatening about, and her plans to leave her husband for good had all but dissipated. Fern watched her father and mother leave in their separate cars, looking both as pleased as Punch, and she smiled to herself, thinking, well, that ended well, didn't it? It was only years later that Fern's mother told her about her rather extraordinary encounter with a male Bigfoot. "I'm sure you don't believe me, love, but I promise you my story is true. That Bigfoot was bashful, but he chased after me, Fern. I thought he was going to kill me. Instead, he gave me a flower. Can you believe that? Yes, I can, said Fern. I believe you, Mum. You do? But of course I believe you, Mum. You wouldn't make up a thing like that, would you? It sounds like you won the heart-over of a male Bigfoot. Fern's mother chuckled, and Fern thought to herself, so he's still around, is he? That male Bigfoot who's got a thing for women with fair skin. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.